Welcome once again to Heart of the Shepherd. We are in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 10, and the title of our devotional is Forgotten by Man, but Not by God. I do invite you to open your Bible with me to Nehemiah, chapter 10. Well, a little bit of the setting. The people had stood and listened to Ezra as he read the law and the commandments and rehearsed the nation's failure to keep its covenant with the Lord in the prior chapter. Then the nation's leaders affirmed the Lord's faithfulness and their desire to renew the covenant with him in the closing verses of Ezra 9. Now, in Ezra chapter 10, we have the confirmation of the covenant, Nehemiah chapter 10. And so we ask the question, who signed and sealed the covenant between the Lord and the nation? Well, Nehemiah 10 gives us the names of those who affixed their names to the covenant. Now, admittedly, this would be an easy chapter to pass over. After all, we have 84 men that are named in the first 27 verses, and they really have little meaning to 21st century believers. But I would suggest that they serve as a reminder that the Lord does not forget those who are His. Now, typical of his zeal for the Lord and the nation, Nehemiah was the first to sign the covenant in chapter 10 and verse 1. He was then followed by the spiritual leaders of Israel, including the priest, verses 2 through 8, the Levites who served with the priests, verses 9 through 13, and then 44 other leaders who are identified as, quote, the chief of the people, verses 14 through 27. And so then we have what I would suggest is the consent of the people to the covenant recorded in verse 28 and 29. And so we read that the rest of the people followed their leaders, including the priests, the Levites, the porters, the singers, and the Nethinims, who I would remind you are temple servants, verse 28. Now, we read that they separated themselves from the people of the land. So the people of the lands would have been non-Hebrew. And so they separated from the people of the land unto the law of God. And then we read their wives, their sons, their daughters, everyone had knowledge and understanding. Now, that's an important phrase. Notice that the people, having heard the covenant read and explained, and with knowledge and understanding, affirmed their consent to be bound by the covenant to the Lord as a people and nation. And so, bonded by their mutual consent to the covenant, we read that the people clave to their brethren, literally bonded to their brethren, their nobles, and they entered into a curse and into an oath to walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and to do all the commandments of the Lord our God and his judgments and his statutes, verse 29. And so the people, having full understanding of their covenant relationship with the Lord, entered into it, the leaders by signing it, and the people by verbally affirming it. And then consider with me verses 30 through 39, the contents and ordinances of the covenant. As with any sincere covenant, there were affirmations and consequences should the covenant statutes be broken. Now, the people covenanted that they would not allow their daughters, their sons, to become unequally yoked with unbelievers. There again, the people of the land. They also reaffirmed they would keep the Sabbath day, and should the heathen of the land come to sell or buy on the Sabbath, they would not defile the holy day. That is the day set aside unto the Lord. The people then needed to affirm their faith and understanding of God's requirements. All acknowledge both the reward, that is the blessings, and consequences, the curses, that come to a covenant people. And then consider the care and support of the temple. Now, the people affirmed their support of the temple by each one giving, we read in verse 32, the third part of a shekel for the service of the house of God. Now, in Moses' day, a tax of a half shekel was required of those 20 years and older in Exodus chapter 30. Perhaps because of the people's poverty, the requirement to support the temple was limited to 1/3 shekel each. Now, we also find that various offerings were renewed, including the wood offering used for sacrifices and to keep a perpetual fire burning on the altar in verse 34. There was also the first fruits offering, which was reestablished and served as a reminder that God requires tithes of our first and best. That's in verse 35 through verse 37. Then every firstborn son was to be dedicated to the Lord, redeemed by offering a lamb in verse 36. And also the people were taught that their tithes and offerings were to support the Levites who ministered in the temple and their households, verses 37 through 39. In turn, the Levites were to tithe of the tithes given to them and their families. Well, having been instructed in the law's demands and accepting its blessings and curses, the people affirmed their covenant with the Lord, and they said, and I quote verse 39, "We will not forsake the house of our God," speaking of the temple. Well, closing thoughts and applications. I want to close by reminding you of the essential practice and observance of corporate fellowship and worship. Israel's leaders and people publicly affirmed their covenant with the Lord as individuals, as families, households, tribes, and nation. Of course, the same is required of all believers. The writer of Hebrews encouraged and admonished all believers not to forsake, and I quote, "the assembling of yourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching." And so we ask, what day is approaching? What day is that? And that day is Christ's second coming, when he will gather all believers unto himself. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 1. Well, I close with a challenge, and it is that your vows to the Lord are essential, and your service to him will not be forgotten. Well, we only have one more devotion in our study of the book of Nehemiah, and that will come tomorrow. I appreciate you being a part of the Shepherd. God bless you, and bye-bye.